moved to town in 1982, in my early 20s, and I heard about the Hohmans, and I was like, I was in awe, and I was always afraid to even like think I could ever talk to Ole Hohman, and so it was a wonderful discovery to find out that he's this wonderful, approachable, thoughtful, kind person. And I'm really grateful that he is sharing history with us, which he does whenever we talk. Yeah, whenever he's here. So again, we're just so blessed and grateful that Ole's presenting today on the flume, which is up at his end of the lake there. So thank you, Ole.
Thank you, Althea. Before I start, there's a couple of really good sources that, if you ever get a chance, Althea ran a copy of this out, but this is a magical place by, it's Dooney Allwood, which was the oldest Allwood son. Their dad, Howard, was the guy that you're going to see in a minute.
Try to get away.
Howard played a big part in history and operation of the flume, and he and a guy named Mel Hagee were responsible for taking care of the flume. And when the logs came down the flume and ended up into the lake, then it was their job to boom those logs up. And then they had a tugboat called the Williamsport that would come from the mill up the lake every day around noon and pick up the boomer logs and take them back down to the mill pond, which is, of course, Spirit Shores is where the mill was. But anyway, this is really a great recollection. It basically takes place from 1926 to 1934. And that's when his family spent the first year in a little, if I want to make it sound good, I'll say cabin. If I want to be honest, I'd call it a shed. But they lived, his dad lived in the shed at 40 Dam. And 40 Dam is probably a mile past the meadow. And it was the first place that they would dam up the flume and float logs down. And don't ask me how they did that, because that's beyond my intelligence. I've tried to figure it out and think about it. And it's one of those questions I wished I would ask somebody that was around the flume. And anyway, this is a good resource, and he talks about what it was like growing up. And the next year they spent in the flume tender's cabin, which was a little log cabin right down by the flume. It's no longer standing. I remember in the 50s through probably the 80s, you could walk inside this log structure. There would be either no roof or very little roof left. And then each year it would kind of weather a little bit more and finally disappear. But there was a root cellar that we as kids would play in, and we'd play in that cabin and stuff. But he talks about living there for a year, and that's where he was born, in the flume tender's cabin. Then they moved to the big cabin, which happens to be what we call the big cabin that is next door to where my wife and I live. And that's where I spent all my time. growing up was my dad and mom had the big cabin, and we'd be there spring through fall. And it was built in 1929 or 1909, and it's doesn't have any trusses and just has cable in it, like this building. Somebody pointed that out to me last time I was talking. I said, "You mean kind of like this?" And I went, "Oh yeah, exactly like this." But anyway, that's a good source. And then the other one that I use somewhat is they had a nostalgia magazine that was put out in Spokane. I had a subscription to this for many, many years, and early on they had quite a few articles either of Spirit Lake or in the surrounding area that was pretty interesting. After a while it was more about Spokane, and I guess my interest level dropped off and I quit subscribing to it. But this particular publication has got a picture. That's Howard Allward. And that shows him on the flume, and he's the one I was talking about, Howard Allward and Mel Hagee, as being two of the key players in the flume and the logging operation with Panhandle Lumber. Now you wonder why they use flumes. There's probably three big reasons. One, most of the timber was on really rugged terrain where there weren't roads. The second thing is the roads weren't very good when they had roads. I remember in 1955, Mary on the island fell and broke her hip, and she communicated with the family over on the mainland there, right next to Bronze Bay, by the name of Norbert, an Annabelle thing that they could communicate and say. Usually she needed cigarettes and whiskey, but this time she broke her hip, and so they had to go across by sled. It was in the wintertime, and the road only went to Silver Beach at that time. So my Uncle Jim, they got a hold of him and said, "Will you take the dozer and plow the road from Silver Beach to Bronze Bay so we could get Mary out of there?" And Doc Frederickson was the doctor in Spirit Lake at that time. Later on, he came, Keith Frederickson had a place at Yosemite, and Doc Frederickson, he delivered our son, and he was the doctor when I was going through school and stuff, and he had three boys that all went to school here. Now, the last one ended up going in Coeur d'Alene when he moved his practice in 1960 to Coeur d'Alene. But anyway, Doc Frederickson said when we were building our house up there, he said, "What are you going to do in the wintertime? Where are you going to live?" And I said, "Well, we're thinking about living up here, but not sure." And in his mind, he was still in 1955 thinking, "You're not going to live here in the wintertime." So anyway, and then the other reason for the flumes, of course, were the trucks. You want to show the picture of the hard-tired? Yeah, that's my Uncle Jim. And when I say hard-tired, the rubber on that metal rim is as hard as, there's no give, there's no tube, there's no air, and you can see how skinny the tires are. So if you get in very steep terrain, you're in real trouble. And it didn't have four-wheel drive. And if you notice, a lot of the early fire truck or logging trucks, they didn't have doors on them. And there was a reason for that. The steep terrain, sometimes the truck would come out of gear or it would get going too fast and the brakes weren't adequate to hold it. And every once in a while, loggers would have to jump out, save their life and say, bye-bye truck or whatever. But that's why they use flume. Okay, Brad, let's give him another. Okay, the construction of the flume, I thought this was a pretty good picture. The upper picture, they're repairing a blowout. And Howard Allward's doing that stuff. But you see how they use those 4x4s to shape the flume, so it was a V shape like this, and they would build that 4x4, brace it up, and they would put piling in beside it to hold it in place and to put those 4x4s in. And in 2002, we were involved in a project and we took out one of the piling. And what was amazing is any of the piling that was above the ground was rotted, but everything below ground was just like the day they put it in. And every one of those piling had been sharpened. They had a point. And they had some kind of hydraulic pounder that put those in. And I can't tell you for sure when that flume was put in, but it had to be about the time when the town was created in 08, 07, whatever, because the timber for the big cabin came from the mill, and it was 1909, so. Yes.
I think was relevant to what you just said. What he was talking about with the timbers driven into the ground, a lot of people think that the pilings in the mill pond caused the leaks that we had in the lake. The pilings in the mill pond still look brand new the day we took them out, just like the pilings up on the flume. It wasn't rotten pilings. That's not the cause of the leaks.
Okay, thank you. They, and I think they were all white pine. That's what somebody told me, and I'm not smart enough to argue with them, but they certainly have lasted, you know, a century, and as long as they're underground. If you notice here, there were places where there was actually two flumes, and one at the very end where they show the logs being dumped into the lake, there was actually a side flume. And I've heard that the flume was 8 miles long that went up to Mount Spokane. I think Mount Spokane from the lake is about 13 miles. And straight line with the creek, you know, probably 10, whatever. But there is, I mentioned 40 dams, there's also a concrete dam up in Washington, up close to Mount Spokane, that they also used to dam up the water and float the logs down. Okay. And that's Marion Allwood. I feel really bad. Althea and I have tried to get the Allward photos because they have, Dooney had an album, and I went to school with Babe Allward and Mary Ely. She was in my class, and she had the album from Dooney, and I said, let's go make some pictures. I love, because some of them were up at the big cabin and where I grew up, and you know, I'd love to see what it looked like in the 20s and 30s. And she said, well, Dooney would kill me if I ever lost any. I said, you could go with me. Well, it never happened. And it's sad, because all these pictures in this nostalgia magazine, and most of these pictures are all word pictures. Okay, Brad.
This is the one showing how they brought the logs into the flume. You didn't have it. I didn't have it yesterday when I talked to you about it. But the logs are coming in on the left, and there's a cable that pulls them on, and then they enter the flume there.
They call that sluicing the logs. Dooney talks about that in here, but it showed even back in the 20s, they had, and boy, it was a pretty dangerous operation, but they had a deal to load logs on trucks where there was a road and they could get to, and OSHA would probably not be too happy. They'd be busy writing tickets. But anyway, that does help see how they got the logs into the flume once they dammed it up and got water in there. And they had a crank telephone that Howard Allward at the flume tender's cabin, where the flume goes into the lake, he would be able to talk to somebody up the flume and say, hey, we're ready for you now. Go ahead and dam up the water and start the water build up before we put the logs in. And in this article by Dooney, he said he remembers laying awake at night in the flume tender's cabin, and he could hear the water running out of the flume into the lake. There was always a little bit of water in the flume. Okay, go ahead, Brad.
Use the microphone again.
Oh, sorry about that. I'm used to yelling, and
Yeah.
the kids would say, can't hear you, Hohman. I said, I can't hear you either. There's just another shot of the logs coming, and you can see the terrain and the trees and stuff around there. That V-shaped flume, I was born in 40 and probably started creek fishing in about 48, maybe 50. And we used to walk. And you can imagine that flume is a lot deeper than it looks there. And it was really tough to be able to keep your feet spread that wide and be able to go. And up on the right-hand side, there would be a 3x12 board that they walked on to get access whenever there'd be a blowout or they needed to do something. And in this article, in this magazine or deal that Dooney wrote, there was a warehouse out in front of our place that when Williamsport would come up the lake to get a boom of logs, they would bring hay for the horses because they horse logged. And then they would bring lumber to repair the flume, and then and grease and stuff because they would grease it too, and whatever they needed for supplies. And I don't have a picture of that. I remember as a kid when my dad and some of his relatives tore it down, and I remember there was a bee's nest up under the kind of roof covering, awning if you call it, and it fell in the water when they took one side down, and the bass just went crazy eating those bees, and I just went crazy looking at those bass. I said, man, I'd like to have some of those. And Dooney talks about the big bass in the lake and stuff around the dock. Okay. This is a picture of the flume in the meadow. And the road is over here, This is potatoes. My dad told me that the meadow was referred to as the Spud Ranch. And they grew potatoes there, and you can see they did a lodgepole pine fence, I'm sure to keep the deer out and whatever from eating potatoes. But most of that meadow is sub-irrigated. When we went ahead and fixed the corral, which is right across from where Steve has his motorhome, we used railroad ties for corner posts. And a guy had a tractor with an auger to dig them, and he only got down a foot, 18 inches, and all kinds of water. And yeah, and it's that way you out there. But anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting. But you can see, get a better idea, with that much water, that's deep. And Fred Golden, I asked Fred if you ever get a chance. Fred Golden knows more about Spirit Lake than almost anybody, and he's older than me, and he remembers better than me. Remember, Brad, when we went uptown and we're doing all the businesses, and I thought, yeah, I'm pretty good at this. We get to LaBarge's place, which is Joe's hole now, and I'm going, okay, what was his name? And Fred said, yeah, Louis and Mary LaBarge were the ones that had that, and and went on with the story, and I'm going, okay, Fred. But he really is good. I was hoping he'd come because he could tell you a little more about some of this. He's a little older and remembers things really well. Okay, go ahead, Brad. All right, now this is the flumes dumping the logs into the lake. And you can see there's actually two flumes. There was and I don't know why, but I know they had side flumes that came into the main flume up quite a ways towards Mount Spokane. But anyway, they would boom those, and all the boom was is they'd take a bunch of logs and they could cable them together or rope them together and then pull them down with yeah, Jim?
In relationship to the lake.
What's that?
And like in relationship to the lake where the flume comes in this picture, current tide. Was that left of your place then, or would it come out right by the creek?
This is really pretty darn close
Right
to
to
where
the
Brickle
creek.
Brick comes into
Okay.
the lake.
All right.
Same place, didn't really change. And the flume tender's cabin was towards our house from the creek, but not a long ways. Probably, I don't know, maybe 100 feet, something like that.
So the Ford's house is there now, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Okay, Brad. Well, that just kind of gives you an idea how many logs they get in there. And you can see how every once in a while one log get going too fast, or they get kind of pushing each other and out the side, and then they have to stop the process and repair the flume and get the logs, and yeah, a lot of work.
Those are pictures I found in our collection.
Okay, now that's Wanda Lockley. Wanda Lockley was married to Walt Lockley, and they were the ones that had Lockley's store that used to be Kipling's store.
And let's see.
Yeah. Oh, that really gives you. Flip that back. That gives you an idea there of how steep
The side.
and deep that flume was. And I forgot to mention something else. Fred Golden still has a scar on his foot from being on the flume, and he had tennis shoes on. And when they would have a blowout on the side of the flume, they would put a bandsaw in there in some places to kind of fill the gap. Well, he fell down and cut his foot through his tennis shoe on the bandsaw. He said, I still got the scar. I was hoping you'd come, we could look at it. But anyway.
So let me interject, can I interject this for a second? So after, the flume was left there, and the kids went up and fished off the flume, right?
Oh, yeah.
So that's how, when we talk about Fred being up there, Fred was this kid going up to fish up the creek, and it was way easier to go on the flume than it was to do the brush below. And so it was like a little highway for kids. So I just wanted to clarify that,
No, that's really a good point, Althea. And Fred reminded me, he said, when we were kids, it was easy to fish the creek because our family had cattle and we had open grazing, and those cows would create a path along the creek where they'd go in and drink. And so they kind of kept the brush down. Now you try to get into the creek and boy, you got brush and fishing off the flume was kind of a challenge because you gotta have your hands free to be able to do the pole and get the line into the water, and you got a fish on. The real challenge was getting it from the creek up over the side of the flume into the flume itself before it slipped off or whatever. And some of the fish were pretty big, not huge by any standard, but most of the fish were Eastern Brook, and that creek water was brutally cold. We would hay the meadow in the last part of July and first part of August. My uncle would swath it, my dad would come behind with a chopper, and then we had 3 big trucks, ton and a half trucks, with wooden racks with real fine chicken wire inside. And so they'd blow the hay into those trucks until they got full. Then they would take the truck from the meadow, drive down the lake road. You can imagine meeting loaded hay truck on the lake road, especially before they widened it and fixed it. And then guess what? The landfill bridge that's theirs now, that went in 1952. When we hayed in the 40s, my dad and uncle got this property in 41, so they hayed from 41 to 52, and you're on that high bridge. That's on Kylan that you were talking about, Doug. And that bridge would do this towards the end, and that's when they finally decided, probably not safe, maybe we better make. The land bridge was all that Lakes Highway District could afford. It wasn't probably the right thing to do because that opening between Fireside and rocks over on the other side is 967 feet or something like that. And when they had the high bridge, the water could come all the way through there, and the only obstruction would be the piling. And so that kept the mill pond bottom sealed with the silt that would go through there. And then all of a sudden, you put in a landfill, and my dad fought with Lakes Highway District and said, you better make that opening as big as you can because you're cutting off that part of the lake from the rest of the lake, and there's going to be problems. And it was supposed to be 60 feet. It ended up being 35, and then when the kids put the rocks in there, it's 20 feet. And it scours the bottom, and there you go. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Is there any more pictures?
Just this one, and that's the daughter of Colonel Stanley's sister. Althea can probably tell better, but we got this dynamite box donated because a couple of years ago he sent this to us. It cost about $50 to mail it to us from like North Carolina, and his family were tenders of the flume back then, and they used this for an end table because they were they used dynamite a lot to blow up stumps for their road building and stuff. And you probably know the stories about the people getting hands blown off and stuff by finding dynamite up there, right?
Well, my dad liked to play with dynamite, and he got involved in a silver mine up by Sandpoint, by Sagal, Silver Butte, and he had an '84 Chevy Camino, and he'd go into Spokane and get a box of dynamite and say, "You want to go up to the mine?" And I'm going, "Geez, not really. I don't want to get blown up today." So every once in a while I'd be stupid and say, "Yeah, I'll go along with you." So we'd go up there, and that was just the start of it. Then we'd take that dynamite and we put it in an ore car, and then we have to use the ore car to get into the mine. And the mine is dripping water, and you can see where it doesn't look like the shoring timbers are really too well done, and you're going, "Is this my last hurrah?" My dad, "Oh, there's no problem." And he says, "As long as I got the caps here and the dynamite's back there, we're okay." And I'm going, "Oh, yeah." Because my dad sometimes, I guess I inherited it, that our brain sometimes goes on tilt. The last thing I want to mention to you about logging and working on the flume. In this deal, Magical Place, Dooney talks about his dad. And he said, "My dad worked 10 to 12 hours a day, and he got paid $3.65 a day. Now, if you take 10 hours a day, that's 36.5 cents an hour. If you take 12 into it, it's 30 cents an hour. Either way, it's not very big money." And I know he worked 6 days a week, but in the wintertime they didn't work. There wasn't, the mill was smart. They ran a steam pipe back out into the mill pond and kept it open so it wouldn't freeze over. Matter of fact, they ran the steam pipe up the hill and heated some of the mill houses. The mill had 48 houses in Spirit Lake. So it really was a mill town. But enough. Any questions? Confused you all?
How long has it been up since you've been up to where the flume started?
What's that?
About where the flume started, how long has it been since you've been up there?
Oh, you know, I'm glad you asked that question, Doug. When we would fish the flume, the best part of the flume was from the lake up to the meadow and just past it about a quarter of a mile to a place called Cedar Landing. And that part was starting to deteriorate and was almost flat. The part by the lake was still pretty close to original. But the mill sold out in August of 1941. So after the mill, and my dad and uncle either had to, I've talked about this before, I don't want to go on that. Anyway, they ended up with that property, and there was nobody to really take care of the flume, and there was no use for the flume. They had already started using trucks some. I remember seeing trucks Paul Seibert, his dad worked at the mill. His dad actually got the time clock from the mill, and Paul had it, and Jerry B has got it now. But anyway, Paul Seibert's dad took a picture of 1938, some family pictures, and then he took pictures of a truck pulling in. There was actually a road, you know, where you go into Spirit Shores, right connected onto that almost. There was a road that went parallel to the lake, to the water, up about, 20 feet. And what they did is they would take logs and place those perpendicular to the water and to this road. And then a person would come in with their load of logs. This one in the film that I saw, that I copied and I have on a video, someplace in storage, who knows where. Anyway, it shows the guy getting out and he takes the chain binder off. He's got, I think, 2 chains on this load of logs. And then he gets up on top, he's got a peak, and he rolls off the top log, and it hits those logs down there and rolls into the water. And that's how people unloaded their logs when they trucked them in rather than flumed them in. Kind of dangerous every step of the way. Yeah, Brad?
When we were talking yesterday, you mentioned about how you touched on it a little bit here, but if you could list, you said your place was 39, is that right? And then as it went up, there was dams at certain other places. And what exactly do you remember about those other numbers?
Well, as near as I remember, 38 was kind of where we're at. And that the numbering system for Panhandle. And then it went up from there. And I believe the 3 logging camps that were in operation until they finally shut things, well, the fire took care of a lot of it. And then when they sold out, the fire happened in August of 1939. And there are pictures of the Spokesman Review of pickups, trucks, Model A's, with the rumble seat and stuff, with all their possessions, and people left town. My dad said that Spirit Lake at one time had close to 3,000 people. And at least half of them left in 39. Then in 41, when they had a bunch of white pine and timber down by Beauville and Deary that they could ship by rail and bring it up to the Panhandle mill and convert it to lumber. So they operated kind of a haphazard operation from 39 to 41, and then they finally, the investors back east said, we want to get our money back and let's sell it. The rest is history. But the logging camps that my dad used to deliver fuel to, and I remember as a kid going up and shooting gophers in the 40s, late 40s, early 50s, and they were places where there were stilts all around, and it was just a field and a road that went through the field, and you could kind of envision where they had a camp. And if I remember right, the first camp was 42, then the next one was 43, and then the one going west towards Mount Spokane was Camp 44. But there were 3 main camps. And something I don't know, I asked Sam Brown, and I video or audio taped him, and again, where was my audio tape? But he talked about his dad was the night watchman security guy for the mill, Emmett Brown. And I think they ran 2 12-hour shifts, but I'm not positive of that. But I know after the fire, it didn't run on a regular basis, and people were leaving town. And
One more thing. Are you very familiar with the Brickle Creek walking trail? You know, it starts up about
9 miles.
milepost 9. There's a little pull-out and a place where you can park 2 or 3 cars. And then there's a walking trail along the river, or the creek. And when you're up there, there's a whole lot of tin cans like it was a logging camp up there. And we also noticed the first place you come and there's you can see rocks down below. If you actually go down in those rocks, you can see they had a dam of some sort in that area, which we discovered just because there's still remnants of it blocking off some of the water. You don't know anything about that logging camp, would you?
No.
Okay.
I always was going to go with Paul Buckland because they kind of helped with that trail, and he kind of knew some of the history of the logging camps and stuff. But
That's why I asked you how long it's been since you've been up there, because I was up there 4 years ago. After you couldn't drive, I was up there many times back when we could take our trucks up there. We could go right to the top camp, and it's right underneath the condos. Not very far below the condos.
Yep.
That if you walk, the problem is at that point the mountain is really steep. That's why there was no camps above it. In fact, there was still remnants of the potato plants that they were growing up there. Yeah, and there's lots of cans, like what we were talking about, lots of cans, lots of metal parts laying around. And if you're walking up that walk, it's not the first time you cross the cliff, but it's the second time you cross it. And then it starts getting real steep. And just past that is where their top camp used to be. And you can still see a lot of remnants of it, you know, in the metal, rusted metal, but all the wood stuff's gone, all the buildings are gone. I remember the log flume, not quite as well as you, but I remember spending quite a bit of time on the log flume too, as it was rotting away, and it was getting harder and harder to find any place that you could really walk on it very far. Because I didn't get to start doing it until about 62, you know, a little bit after you.
something kind of interesting in this Nostalgia magazine is said there is a flume museum at Sherman Pass. And I've been to Sherman Pass, but I was going to Google it, and I didn't. But it's either in Washington or Idaho. And I don't know if you remember the film Charlie the Lonesome Cougar. They did that in the 70s, and I happened to be teaching and coaching at Sequim, Washington. And that's where Charlie, all the cougars, there's about 4 of them, they used to be Charlie, to do the different things for the film. But they had a Sequim Wildlife Park thing that they had tigers, they had bears, they had lions, they had cougars, whatever. And I had a couple of kids in my class that worked there, and so they'd say, hey, come on out, and whatever, and we'd go out there, and my cousin and his wife went. And I'll tell you what, somebody says red's not a good color to be around animals. My cousin's wife had on a pink jumpsuit and walked by the tiger cage, and that tiger came out and threw himself against the side of the cage, scared all of us. And I'm going, okay, I think we'd be moving on. And she still talked about how scary that was. And, yeah. Okay, I'm done. It's hot.